Vladimir Putin, the Media Man. How Vladimir Putin uses the media to control and propagate modern Russian society, by Duncan Cockfoster. The national media has always been a tool utilized by dictators to uphold and maintain their regime. Under the Soviet Union, the media was an essential extension of the government. That culture remains today, and Vladimir Putin has taken advantage of it to gain control of the country. Modern Russia has been monitored throughout the 20th century to varying degrees under varying leaders. Stalin was extremely strict and heavily censored print media, radio, and even the arts to ensure that no message not approved by him and his government was released to the people. In the late 1980s, the print media was almost completely controlled by the Russian government. In 1988, 80% of Russian journalists were members of the Communist Party, and any newspaper editor was required to be approved by the Communist Party before they were allowed to become a newspaper editor. At the time, there were two main newspapers in Russia. One of them was called Pravda, which means the truth, and the other one was called Izvestia, which means the news. It was a joke at the time that the truth did not contain any truth, and the news did not contain any news. The Soviet government strictly enforced what the media could and couldn't report. They created a journalistic culture in Russia that still exists today, where journalists feel like it is their job to support their leaders and not criticize them. This idea was ingrained in the minds of many Russian citizens during the Soviet era, and was done in a variety of ways. One such way that the Soviet government created this culture was by influencing higher education. The Moscow University School of Journalism, which was the alma mater of many of the employees of the large newspapers in Russia, actively trained its journalists to support the Communist Party and further its agenda. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the new law on mass media was signed in 1991. It guaranteed freedom of speech and independence for media outlets as part of the larger national Russian movement towards becoming a freer, more open society. However, the law did not have its intended effect. Some state-run media outlets remained operational, and some private news media outlets opened up, such as NTV and Kommersat. They were independently owned and did not report to any government, and for a time they were moderately popular in Russia. However, these private outlets had their own problems. For example, both NTV and Kommersat supported Yeltsin in the election of 1996, despite the fact that he had a serious alcohol problem. They did this because they were owned by business tycoons whose interests would be served if Yeltsin were to be elected. This illustrates the culture of media in Russia. If you are the owner of a media station, it is your right to use it for whatever you want. There is no duty to report the truth. This is the culture that Putin took advantage of to help his rise to power. Putin has his own perspective on the media. It should be used to help spread the government's message. It is not a watchdog over the government or an unbiased source of truth. It is simply a tool for propaganda. This idea is not too far out of line with the cultural precedent set by the Soviet government. And Putin echoes that government more and more. In 2002, after its offices were raided by federal officers, NTV was bought by Gazprom Media, a puppet of the government. The move turned NTV, one of the last free media outlets in Russia, into an asset for Putin and allowed him to use it to further his political agenda. This is an example of how Putin operates differently than his predecessors. He uses financial pressure, political pressure, and threats to get media outlets to perform how he desires. He does not demand outright control, but instead is crafty and manipulative to get people to do what he wants. A good example of this is TV Rain. TV Rain is the only television channel remaining that prioritizes an unbiased perspective on issues potentially damaging to the government. They are unafraid to report on issues like the war in Ukraine or government corruption in Russia. But in Russia, freedom has its price. After releasing a poll in 2014 that was deemed too controversial, TV Rain was forced to move to a private apartment because no one in Russia would lease space to them. They were removed from most of the cable providers in Russia and survived only on the web. Echo of Moscow is one of the last free radio stations that still operates in Russia, but like TV Rain, its days are numbered. Recently, a reporter on the show tweeted a crass remark about a government official's son dying. It looked as though the station might be shut down, but Alexei Venediktov, the station's editor-in-chief, weathered the storm. He says he is thankful for every day he is allowed to continue operating, and also says that the second Putin gives the command to shut down the station, his time is over. He knows that his days are limited, because there is no true free speech in Russia. Owners of media outlets point out that Putin does not often directly order the shutdown of a particular media station. He instead commands a culture that demands obedience to the government and does not allow for free speech. It is a culture that has been inherited from Soviet times. There is limited freedom of speech because of this legacy from the Soviet era. Vladimir Putin was able to gain control of the media outlets relatively quickly because a strong demand for unbiased and fair media in Russia never arose.